Hey everybody, and welcome back to another lecture. In this lecture, we're going to create a post request method for our to-dos. This will allow us to create new to-dos from an API, and then we'll be able to retrieve those to-dos from the database. So the first thing we need to do is to create a new class to-do that extends base model. Now, if we remember, we have to import Pydantic. So right under SQL Alchemy, I'm going to say from Pydantic import base model. And now also let's import field from Pydantic. So right after base model, I'm going to say comma field. And now right under getDB, I'm going to create a new class. This class is going to be called to-do, and it's going to extend base model. And now here we need to create all the variables within the class to-do that we want to receive as a post request. Now within our models.py, we can see our to-dos is going to have an ID, a title, a description, a priority, and a complete. For us to create a successful record, we need at least a title, description, priority, and complete, and then we'll let the ORM handle all of the ID auto increments. So let's go back to main, and let's say we need a title of type string, a description, which we're going to say is optional, and also a string, and we're going to need to import our optional from typing. So if we scroll back up to the top, we can now see optional from typing. And I'm going to just close this extra space. Then we need to say priority of type int. And this time I'm going to say is equal to field. And then as the parameters of field, I'm going to say greater than is equal to 0, less than is equal to 6, which remember, greater than 0 means 1, and less than 6 means 5. So post request method will only be successful if the priority is between a 1 or a 5. And then as a description, I'm going to say the priority must be between 1 and 5. And then finally, I'm going to say complete, which is of type Boolean. Now that we have our class to-do that extends base model complete, we can now go ahead and create our post request method API. So right under our get to-do by ID, I'm going to create a new API request method of post with an empty URL string. And the function we create is going to be called create to do. So async def create to do. Now the first thing we want to pass in is the request body of a to do. So we need a parameter to do, which is of type to do. And now we need to create a dependency on the database. So DB is of type session, which equals depends, and as the parameter get DB. And now we want to say to-do model. And the first thing we're going to want to do is create a new variable called to-do model, which is of type models.todos. And now I want to add each item of to-do over into the to-do model. So to-do model.title will be equal to to-do.title. To-do model description will be equal to to-do description. To-do model.priority is going to be equal to to-do.priority. And to-do model.complete will be equal to to-do.complete. And now we want to use our DB parameter and say db.addToDoModel. And now this add functionality places an object in the session. Its state will be persisted to the database on the next flush operation. Well, to commit this object and to flush it, we need to say db.commit. When we say db.commit, the commit functionality says flushes pending changes and commits the current transaction. If no transaction is in progress, the method will first auto-begin a new transaction and commit. And now we just want to show the user that, hey, your item was successfully created. So I'm going to say we're going to return a dictionary. And now we're going to return a status code of 201. With a transaction of successful. All right, let's save our file and make sure our server is running. And now I am going to switch over to our Swagger documentation and refresh the screen. And here we can see we have a new post of create to do. If we say try it out, we can add in a new title, which I'm going to say is drink more water, with the description of I haven't been feeling well, with a priority of 5, and a complete of false. I'm now going to say execute, where we get our curl post call of drink more water, I have not been feeling well, 5 and false. We get a status code of 200 with a response body of 201 with a transaction of successful. And the reason I said a 201 is a 201 status code means the request has been fulfilled and resulted in a new resource being created. And now if we scroll all the way back to the top and we say read all, try it out, and execute, we now have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have a new to-do of drink more water, I have not been feeling well, priority 5, ID 4, and it is not complete. This wraps up the lecture on how to create a post request method and to save that item to the database and then fetch it. And I will see you in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to create a put request method for our to-do application. What we're going to do is after we create the put request method, we're going to create a new function with a path parameter that's going to align up with the request method path parameter, where we can identify the to-do by the ID and then enhance it by a to-do request body. The first thing we need to do is create a @appDecorator.put, and as the parameter, I'm going to say /to-do-ID wrapped in brackets. Here, we're going to have to create a new function called updateToDo by saying async def updateToDo. And as the parameters, I'm going to say to-do ID, which is of type int, again, to match the path parameter. And then we need to create a new parameter called to-do, which is of type to-do. And lastly, we need to pass in DB, which is of course type session, and it's going to be a dependency on getDB functionality. Now the first thing we need to do is create a new variable called to-do-model, which is equal to db.query models.todos. And then we need to say filter by models.todos.id is equal to to-do ID, and then return the first record found. We then want to say if to-do model is none. So if we could not find any records to match the requirements of filter above, then we want to raise the HTTP exception. If to-do is not none, that means we're not going to raise the exception. So therefore we can now switch over to-do model to now match the to-do that was sent in by saying to-do model.title equals to-do title. To-do model.description equals to-do.description. To-do model.priority equals to-do priority. And lastly, to-do model.complete equals to-do.complete. We then want to add to-do model to db.add. And then finally, db.commit. And then just like up above where we did for post return status of 201 with a transaction of successful, we're going to do the exact same thing. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it down here, where we're going to return a status of 200 this time though. Let's save the file, make sure your application is running, and let's now open up our browser. I'm going to refresh the screen, and I'm going to say try it out and execute the get all. And now let's change cut the lawn to being true. So it is complete. We completed the task. So the ID is 2. So let's go down to put, try it out, and let's say at the ID of 2, we want to enhance this to now be true. So title is cut the lawn, description, the grass is getting long. I changed the priority to 1 and it is now complete. Let's now execute. We can see the curl command of now type put, where we're passing in the title, description, priority, and complete. We get the response body of status 200, transaction is successful. And now let's scroll all the way back up to the top and re-execute this application. And if we scroll back down, we can now see at the primary key of 2, title is cut the lawn, description, the grass is getting long, priority is 1, and this task is complete. This wraps up how to use a put request method, and I will see you in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to be creating our delete request method to be able to delete to-dos. How we're going to be doing this is by creating a delete request method that takes in a path parameter of to-do ID. And we're just going to delete the record where the ID matches the to-do ID. So let's dive in. Right under our put request method, let's create a new request method of @app.delete with the parameter of a to-do ID wrapped in brackets. And now the function name is going to be delete to do. So we can do this by saying async def delete to do. And as the parameters, we're going to say to do ID of type int. And we just need a DB session, which is going to be dependent on getDB. Now, the first thing we need to do is validate that the ID exists. So I'm going to say to-do model equals db.query. And as the first parameter, I'm going to say models.todo dot filter models.todo.id equals to-do ID. And then dot first to return the first record. And now I'm going to say if to-do model is none, then raise an HTTP exception. If an exception is not thrown because to-do is not none, then we want to create a query that filters by the IDs and then finally deletes. So db.query models.todos dot filter models.todos.id equals to-do.id dot delete. And now lastly, we want to say db.commit. And lastly, I'm going to return this command of a status 200 back and with a transaction of successful. Now, the first thing you may be thinking is, why don't we create this into a function just like we did with the HTTP exception? Well, that's a great idea. So let's go ahead and do that. So right under this, right before the HTTP exception, I'm going to create a new function called successful response that takes in a status code, which is a int. And I'm going to return this right here. However, instead of a 201, I'm going to pass in the status code. And now we can just call successful response to each method above. Then I think everything else we're actually returning a model of to do. All right, let's make sure our server is running. And now after I save, let's open up our Swagger docs. Let's refresh the screen. And now we have a delete functionality. If we say try it out and execute, we can see that our cut the lawn with an ID of 2 is true. So that means the to-do is complete. So let's delete it. So we need to pass in 2 to the delete API. We click down here, and as the path parameter, we pass in a 2. And we say execute. We're going to get a null response body. All right, so the null response body is most likely coming because we didn't return our status response. But if we scroll back to the top and we execute this, we can see that our ID was deleted. The error shows up because of in our code where we call successful response, we need to say return back to this function. So right before this, let's type in return. Let's resave the application and let's go back to our browser, refresh, let's say read all, execute. We can see that we have a 1, 3, and 4. I'm actually just going to go ahead and create a new to-do. So try it out. I'm going to make the priority 1. And I'm going to leave everything else exactly how it is. Execute, and we just created a new to-do. Go back up here and execute to get all of them. And ID 5 is our new to-do, which is string and is complete. So let's go back down here and let's pass in 5 as our to-do ID. And click execute. And voila, we have a status code of 200 with a transaction of successful. We scroll back up here and execute and to get all, we can see that there is no longer a to-do with an ID of 5. However, if we go back down here again and re-execute this delete functionality with an ID of 5, we get a to-do not found HTTP exception raised. And there we have it. We created APIs with a database running that saves all of our to-dos with a get, post, put, and delete the CRUD operations attached to it. But we don't want the application to be done because anybody can delete, create, and get the to-dos. Don't you think it would be a little bit more realistic if we had some type of authorization and authentication attached to the application? Well, let's go ahead and do this in the next section. This wraps up the video on how to create the CRUD operations with the database rendering, and I will see you in the next video.